Here we are today, March 17th, 2020. We are in the midst of a global pandemic of coronavirus. And so this is a topic that seems very appropriate because viruses are something that are important, but also something that a lot of students and a lot of people don't know much about. So let's jump right into what are viruses. And we want to first talk about what aren't they, because the thing you might want to remember, they're just weird. They're unlike just about anything else. In fact, they're not even classified as being alive, not even classified as being a living thing by many scientists. So they can die, but they're not really alive like other stuff. So let's talk about what are the different kinds of living things and how and why viruses don't quite fit. Animals, that's us, that's dogs, that's cats, that's giraffes and zoo animals, like I said, and it's also people. Keep an eye on those two gentlemen there because they're going to come up later on in the presentation. But what makes an animal an animal? Usually, animals can move around, but the most important thing, aside from all the other characteristics of living thing, is animals can't make their own food. We are consumers. We are not producers. We cannot do photosynthesis. But, and usually people would include the ability to move around as something that pretty much all animals have. But guess what? Not all of them do. Here's two that do not move around. Coral and sponges, sea sponges. They both live in the ocean. Coral look more like a plant or a rock, and they're part of the phylum Cnidaria. But they are an animal. They do not do photosynthesis. They have to eat other stuff, and that's why they're an animal. Same thing with sponges. They eat things. They do not do photosynthesis. So moving along to something else we all know very well. Plants are a different kingdom. They do photosynthesis, and that's really important, and that makes them a producer. But another really important thing and a difference between animals and plants is that plants have cell walls, but animals do not. The animal cell is more like squishy. It has what's called a cell membrane, whereas this wall that cells have makes it more difficult for water and stuff to get in and out, but also gives a plant more rigidity so it can stand up tall and grow tall without falling over. So it gives the plant strength. Fungi, another well-known kingdom of life, not like animals and not like plants, because even though they kind of look like plants, and you can see this mushroom here, it kind of looks like a plant, but fungi do not do photosynthesis. They cannot make their own food. They are decomposers. They live off of dead stuff. Some examples of fungi are mushrooms and mildew and molds and yeast. Yeast is important in a few different things, a lot of different things really, but one is making bread. And athlete's foot, which is, some people have been unfortunate enough to get. But remember, fungi aren't plants. They can't do photosynthesis. They can't make their own food. They are decomposers. Now, protists are almost as weird as viruses. They are alive, but some definitions of protists, why are they protists? Because they just don't fit anywhere else. They are really little. They're usually a single cell or a few cells, which makes them kind of like bacteria, but they're not bacteria. And one of the cool things about protists is that they can actually move, some of them. So here's an amoeba, and here's a paramecium. These are two pretty well-known protists. And here's another one that is also pretty well known, especially if you're in biology. It's called a diatom. This is a member of the phytoplankton group, which phyto means plant. Plankton, hopefully it's like little things that float in water that fish live on. But diatoms and phytoplankton are super important. They actually do 80% of all the photosynthesis in the world, provide 80% of all the oxygen that we breathe. We usually attribute that to trees, but no. Phytoplankton are way more important, and they're doing lots of research on these diatoms for a lot of different reasons. What else do we want to know about protists? They can sometimes move. And how do they move? Here's three ways. There's something called a flagella, which is a long tail, cilia, which are little hairs, and pseudopods. So see up here, this long whip-like thing, it sort of spins that around or whips it back and forth, and that helps the amoeba, this protist, swim through the liquid. And then these little hairs around the paramecium would help it move. And here's a last one. This is also an amoeba, and this little part of the body that's sticking out, that's called a pseudopod. Pseudo means fake, pod means foot. So this is a fake foot that they can kind of use to push off and move along. So that's protists. Weird little guys, don't fit anywhere else. Also, by the way, can make you sick, but also can do a lot of, have some important uses in the environment. The next two, eubacteria and archaebacteria. When I was a kid, they just called that Monera. All the bacteria were grouped into one thing. But apparently, from an evolutionary standpoint, these two things are very, very different. So we should technically consider them two different kingdoms. Eu equals new. And so eubacteria are the newer bacteria. Their cells are more like us and a little bit more complex. The archaebacteria, archae means old, and so those are the older, ancient, simple, small cells. They're smaller and they're just not as complex as the newer bacteria. Since we're talking about the coronavirus, and that's one of the reasons we're making this presentation, again, one thing that you should know about bacteria is sometimes, even though there are a lot of good things that bacteria do and important uses for bacteria, they can make you sick. So here's some examples of bacterial infections. Typhoid, which is one we don't get very often anymore. Pneumonia. Sometimes if you get pneumonia, it's caused by a bacteria. Staph infection. I'll bet 20 years ago, I remember talking about staph infections, some of these super staph infections that were just as concerning as some of what we're hearing about viruses right now. They can make you really, really sick. And finally, strep throat. I mean, everybody or most people have heard of strep throat caused by a bacteria. So these bacteria, one important thing about them is that you can sometimes take an antibiotic, and an antibiotic will treat a bacterial infection. It will not treat a virus. We're going to talk about why that is, and that's an important part of the difference between bacteria and viruses, even though sometimes you might classify both of them as quote-unquote germs, but they are very different from each other. You can't treat a virus with an antibiotic. You need a virus or a vaccine to treat a virus. Antibiotics can sometimes treat bacteria, and the whole problem with antibiotics is another thing that we'll save for another time. But moving along, we're going to do a quick quiz now. So if you have a piece of paper, and I recommend that you do, try to see if you can remember these facts from the presentation. Here's question number 1. Write the names of the 6 kingdoms. Here's how you can narrow it down. 2 were bacteria, so they have the word bacteria in the name. See if you can remember that. 1 we're in. 1 is really common. There are probably some of these growing right outside your house. Our school district, actually, one of our neighborhoods is named for one of these. So here they go. Animals, plants, fungi, protists, archaebacteria, and eubacteria. Remember, animals we're in. Plants are pretty common, and we're not like them. Fungus can be hard to remember, but, it's fairly well known. And then protists. That's, to me, the tough one. And obviously then the 2 bacterial. Of the 2 bacteria kingdoms, which one is old and simple? Which one is newer and more like us? Try to remember the hint. 3, 2, 1. Here's the answer. Eu equals new. Eubacteria, that's the newer one. Archaebacteria, that's the old one. There were 3 protists listed in the program. Here's a hint. One starts with the letter A, that's the blobby one that a lot of people know of. One starts with a P, that's the one that had the little hairs all over it, and I'll give you a little more. It's P-A-R, maybe that helps you remember. And finally, D. One of them began with a D. 3, 2, 1. Here comes the answer. Amoeba, that's the blob. Spelling on this. You're not getting graded. but always try to spell things right. Spelling still matters, even though, you might not get graded on all the time. If you're copying something, try to copy it right. Amoeba, paramecium, and diatom. Next question. Of those three protists, which one is the one that's like a plant? It conducts photosynthesis. It's super important. 3, 2, 1. Diatom. This is along with phytoplankton. Remember, phyto means plant. Plankton is stuff floating in the water. They actually do 80% of photosynthesis and produce 80% of Earth's oxygen. Typo here. Which of the 5 kingdoms? It's actually 6, as we said before. Which one is the decomposer? Which one of those up here above? Animals, plants, fungi, protists, archaebacteria, eubacteria. And hopefully you got that it was the fungi. And can you name 3 members of the fungi kingdom? One is something that we eat, and some of them are growing. That's the easier one. Remember, one is used for bread. One of them will make your toes pretty itchy. Some grow in wet areas in bathrooms and things like that. See if you can remember what those are. And 3, 2, 1. Athlete's foot, mildew, yeast, mushrooms, and mold. Because plants conduct photosynthesis, what general category of organism are they? Hopefully you guys, this is one that everybody hopefully knows by now. They're not consumers, they are producers. Can you name the 2 animals that don't move? Remember, these lived in the ocean, and a lot of people wouldn't have even thought they're animals. That might make it difficult. One began with the letter C, and one began with the letter S, and the hint on the S is you probably have some of these in your bathroom or in your kitchen sink. And it was sponges and corals. Sea sponges, not like homemade or artificial sponges, but sea sponges and corals. They are animals, but they really never move. They have to eat stuff. Can you remember the phylum? This is a science bowl question. This is one that you probably don't need to know for regular class, but what phylum are sponges in and what are corals in? This was the scientific name. So sponge was what? And coral was what else? This might not fit on the screen. I may have to read it. So you can't see it. Sponge was porifera. Coral was cnidaria with a silent C. C-N-I-D-A-R-I-A. So that's the end of our presentation. This was what are viruses, and we kind of learned about what viruses are not. They don't fit into any of these other things. They're not an animal. They're not a plant. I know it's obvious. They're not a fungi, because fungi kind of like plants in a way, but they decompose. And for one reason or another that we're going to get to, they don't even fit into these things. These single-celled little germ-like things, protists, archaebacteria, and eubacteria, nope, they're not even that. Viruses are none of those things, and technically they aren't even alive.